The morning light barely touched the courthouse steps as a line of people snaked along the stone facade, murmuring anxiously. Cameras clicked, reporters whispered into microphones, and the occasional shout of a news crew director sliced through the ambient hum. It was the kind of day that felt electrically charged before the storm. Every person inside the building carried a story, a stake, a secret. But no one was more out of place than the tiny figure gripping her mother's hand at the end of the bench. A toddler, no older than 2, with golden curls bouncing as she tugged slightly to see over the polished wooden chairs. Her mother, young and anxious, bent down to adjust her daughter's sweater, smoothing down the fabric with shaking hands. She was a single parent, balancing work, life, and a toddler who had a curiosity as sharp as a razor. Today, she'd promised herself she would stay calm. The case, already notorious, was about to reach a turning point, and she didn't want her daughter caught in the chaos. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with the scent of polished wood and nervous energy. The gallery was filling fast. Families of victims, reporters, and curious onlookers jockeyed for position. At the front, in a specially designated area, sat Max, the police dog. A German shepherd of imposing size, he exuded quiet authority, his sleek coat catching the sunlight streaming through the tall windows. He sat alertly, ears pricked, eyes scanning every movement. Children often giggled at his size. Adults respected it. Max was more than a dog. He was a living testament to law enforcement, trained to detect danger and, somehow, the truth. The judge, a stern figure with graying hair and steel-rimmed glasses, entered, and the room immediately fell silent. Every eye turned to the bench as he called the court to order, the gavel's strike echoing like a heartbeat through the room. Lawyers straightened in their chairs. The defendant, a man in his late 30s with a stubble-lined jaw and tightly pressed lips, shifted nervously, his eyes flicking toward the gallery. He knew he had slipped, yet believed himself untouchable. For weeks, he had danced on the knife's edge of justice, avoiding detection, manipulating evidence, and intimidating witnesses. But today, every fiber of the courtroom seemed to vibrate with a sense that the balance was shifting. The toddler, oblivious to the legal stakes around her, shuffled in her seat, eyes wide and bright. She had always been curious, always pointing at things as if she could see the world in layers invisible to adults. Today, her attention was caught by Max. She leaned forward, gripping the edge of the wooden chair, and stared. Something in the dog's presence fascinated her, not fear but recognition. Something deep, almost instinctual. Her mother noticed the stare and tried to divert her attention, whispering, "Stay here, sweetie. No running." But toddlers, as everyone knows, have a stubborn streak that defies logic, timing, or reason. With a small tug on her mother's hand, she broke free and waddled toward the front, her tiny shoes clattering softly against the polished floor. The gallery went silent for a moment, all eyes tracking the movement of the little intruder. It was an unusual sight, a toddler moving confidently toward the front of a courtroom, where tension hung thick and palpable. The defendant's eyes narrowed. He had dealt with threats before, grown men, trained officers, but he had never dealt with a child who seemed to carry an aura of insight, a presence that made him instinctively uneasy. Max, sensing the change, shifted his weight slightly, the muscles under his coat coiling with alertness. The dog's gaze met the toddler, and the room seemed to pause, suspended in a quiet tension. Then it happened. The toddler pointed a tiny, deliberate finger at Max, then back at the defendant. The action was small, almost imperceptible, but in that moment the room seemed to lean forward collectively, breath held. Her mother gasped, heart pounding, her hands trembling as she reached out instinctively. "Bad man," the toddler whispered. 2 words. A barely audible declaration, but it ricocheted through the courtroom like a cannon blast. Every adult froze. The judge's gavel hovered midair in his hand. The lawyers blinked, unsure whether to move, speak, or pretend they hadn't heard. Max's ears twitched, head tilting slightly, as though acknowledging the weight of her words. Whispers rippled through the gallery. "Did she just? Who? How could a child know?" The murmur grew louder, tension coiling like a snake ready to strike. People leaned forward in their seats, some craning their necks, others gripping the wooden benches as if holding onto reality itself. The defendant's face went pale. Sweat glistened along his temples. He swallowed hard, the tiny words of a toddler cutting through his carefully constructed armor of defiance. Every instinct screamed that she had seen through the shadows he had so meticulously created. His jaw tightened, his knuckles whitened on the edge of the chair. Max's low, rumbling growl added a physical vibration to the tension, a sound that made grown men in the room shift uneasily. The judge cleared his throat, attempting to regain control, but the room had already been captured by a sense of disbelief. The prosecutor, sensing the opportunity, leaned forward slightly, eyes alight with an unspoken thought. Perhaps this child had just pointed out what months of investigation had struggled to prove. The defense attorney, on the other hand, recoiled, fumbling with notes, the plan that had carried him confidently through countless cases suddenly feeling flimsy and inadequate. The toddler's mother froze, paralyzed between fear and awe. Her child's words had transformed the courtroom in an instant, bending the rules of perception, age, and expectation. She whispered under her breath, trembling, "She doesn't even understand what she's done." Yet everyone else in the room did. They understood. Cameras tilted, reporters adjusted microphones, and the courtroom's electric charge seemed to spike. It was more than curiosity now. It was raw, unfiltered suspense. Something pivotal was happening, something that would change the direction of the trial. And everyone, every juror, lawyer, witness, and observer, felt it in their bones. The toddler looked back at her mother, then at Max, her eyes wide and shining as if seeking approval. Her finger, still pointing, trembled slightly, not with fear but with certainty. She had said what she needed to say. And in that moment the courtroom became a stage, every human participant caught in the gravitational pull of innocence exposing truth. A faint gasp came from the back of the room, a sound that echoed like a distant alarm. The judge's gavel finally came down, slicing the tense air, but it didn't break the spell. People leaned forward, the collective breath of the room held tight, knowing that the story had only begun, and that a toddler and a police dog had just upended the expected flow of justice. Outside, the morning sun continued to climb, casting long shadows through the courthouse windows. Inside, time seemed to stretch and contract, focused entirely on a little girl, a massive German shepherd, and two words that no one would soon forget. The courtroom had never been so silent. Even the faint rustle of papers or the distant creak of a wooden chair sounded deafening. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to pause, holding its breath, caught in the weight of a toddler's two words: "Bad man." The jury shifted uneasily in their seats, glancing at one another, unsure if what they had heard was real. Some jurors whispered softly, heads leaning together. "Did she just?" one murmured, the words trailing off into the tension-soaked air. Another juror's hand trembled slightly as it rested on the edge of the bench. Even seasoned court reporters, whose lives revolved around chronicling facts and evidence, found themselves momentarily lost. Max, the police dog, remained seated near the front bench, but his body tensed. His ears pricked, nostrils flaring slightly as he focused on the defendant, the man the toddler had pointed at. He had been trained to detect danger, deceit, and even subtle human emotions, but now, in the tense silence of the courtroom, he was alert in a way that seemed almost human. His low growl rumbled in his chest, faint but unmistakable, and the sound made a few people in the front row shift uneasily. The defendant, the man on trial, froze. His hands, previously resting calmly on his lap, clenched into fists. His knuckles whitened as his breathing hitched. Beads of sweat formed on his brow. He had faced interrogations, intimidating witnesses, and legal challenges that would make most men crumble, but never had a tiny child spoken so directly to him. The words struck him like a hammer to the chest, simple and yet devastating in their clarity. The defense attorney leaned forward, jaw tight, trying to mask his panic. "Your Honor," he began, voice shaky, I don't believe." The judge's gavel cut through the air, silencing him. "Order! All parties quiet in the courtroom," he commanded, though even he seemed rattled. He adjusted his glasses, scanning the gallery as if to find a logical explanation for what had just occurred, but there was none. A toddler, too young to comprehend the full gravity of justice, had pointed directly at the defendant and uttered the words "bad man." That simple declaration carried a weight the room could not ignore. The gallery erupted in whispers, each murmur layering tension on top of tension. Reporters scribbled furiously in notebooks, their pens struggling to keep up with the magnitude of what had happened. One cameraman leaned closer, whispering into his headset, "Did you get that? She actually said it." Another voice crackled over a microphone, This is unprecedented." The toddler's mother, her face pale and her hands trembling, pulled her daughter close. She tried to soothe her, brushing a strand of golden hair from her face. "Sweetie, that's enough," she whispered, voice shaking. But the toddler, oblivious to the chaos she had triggered, tilted her head slightly and repeated her gesture, pointing directly at the defendant. "Bad man," she said again, louder this time, her voice trembling with a mix of innocence and conviction. The room reacted instantly. Every adult, every lawyer, every juror seemed to lean in closer, drawn by the simple honesty of the words. The defendant's eyes widened. His mouth opened slightly as if to argue, to deny, to laugh, but no sound came. For the first time in weeks, he was unarmed in the courtroom, not with physical weapons, not with legal maneuvering, but with a truth he could not control. Max growled again, louder this time, a rumbling warning that seemed to vibrate in the bones of everyone present. The toddler giggled softly, thinking it a game. But for the adults, the sound was a harbinger. The dog's reaction, coupled with her declaration, made it impossible to ignore. The child had named him. She had seen something others could not. The prosecutor leaned forward, excitement flickering in his eyes. For months, he had built his case meticulously, but he had never anticipated this moment, a spontaneous, innocent confirmation of guilt. He kept his voice calm but urgent. "Your Honor, may I request a brief recess?" he asked. "There may be implications here that require immediate attention." The defense attorney's face went pale. He turned to the defendant, who remained frozen, still staring at the toddler as if she had spoken some unspoken truth only he could feel. This is ridiculous," the attorney muttered under his breath, but even he could feel the shift in the room. The scales had tipped. Adults who had been confident now questioned their own perceptions. Outside the courtroom doors, spectators murmured in disbelief. Social media notifications pinged relentlessly as snippets of the moment began circulating. Video clips showed the toddler pointing, her small face filled with a clarity far beyond her age. Commentators speculated, "Is this a miracle, a coincidence, a divine intervention?" The story spread like wildfire, but inside the courtroom there was no time for viral fame. There was only the weight of what had been said. The jury, instructed to remain impartial, found their focus drifting uncontrollably toward the toddler. Each member wrestled with the conflict between the law and instinct. How could a 2-year-old possibly recognize danger, deceit, or guilt? And yet, there was something undeniable in her gaze, in the certainty of her pointing finger. The defendant shifted in his seat, finally attempting to speak. "She's just a child," he said, voice low but trembling. "She doesn't know what she's saying." But his words rang hollow in the charged air. Max's growl deepened, a low, resonant warning. Even the dog seemed to reject the denial, standing as an unspoken arbiter of truth. A witness, a neighbor who had observed the defendant's behavior for months, whispered to another, "I think she's right. She saw him." The words spread like a contagion, building a wave of tension that no one could stop. The courtroom felt smaller, the walls closing in as if the child's declaration had compressed time and space itself. The mother tried to soothe her daughter, stroking her back and whispering reassurances. But the toddler, sensing the gravity of her own action without fully understanding it, tilted her head toward Max again. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and in that gaze was an innocence that cut through fear, deception, and pretense. The judge, who had presided over countless high-profile cases, finally spoke again. "We will continue," he said, his voice steady but firm, carrying an unspoken acknowledgement of the extraordinary moment. But let it be noted for the record, the court has observed an unusual and noteworthy occurrence. We proceed with this context in mind. Even as the proceedings continued, the ripple of the toddler's words spread. Every adult in the room felt it. Every observer sensed it. The case, once defined by logic, evidence, and procedure, had suddenly acquired an element that no one could anticipate. A child's unfiltered insight, sharp and precise, that cut through layers of doubt. And somewhere in the charged silence that followed, a single question hung in the air. Had this tiny, golden-haired girl just altered the course of justice with 2 words? The man in the defendant's chair had faced danger before. He had stared down officers, manipulated witnesses, and even walked free on technicalities he didn't deserve. But nothing in his life had prepared him for this. A tiny child pointing at him in a courtroom and speaking 2 words that struck deeper than any legal argument. Bad man. He sat frozen, palms sweating, mind racing. Every instinct screamed that he was exposed, not just legally but morally, emotionally, spiritually. His carefully constructed armor of arrogance and intimidation had shattered in an instant. His eyes flicked toward Max, the massive German shepherd who sat unmoving but tense, gaze locked on him with something more than alertness. It was understanding, recognition. The dog seemed to know what the toddler had said before anyone else did. The room held its breath, waiting for him to react, but the defendant couldn't. He tried to speak, a nervous laugh forming in his throat, but it faltered. The sound died in his chest. His mouth opened and closed, trying to find a lie, a joke, a deflection, but none came. It was as if the courtroom had condensed all truth into that small child's words, and he had no response. He shifted in his chair, attempting to regain composure, but each movement betrayed him. His foot tapped rapidly, an unconscious drumbeat of anxiety, while his fingers drummed nervously against the table. The defense attorney leaned in, whispering, "Stay calm. Just breathe. We can." But even the attorney's voice carried the tremor of fear. No one had prepared for this. The toddler, meanwhile, remained pointedly focused. She didn't understand the full implications of the situation. She was too young, but her instincts were precise, unerring. Her small finger wavered slightly as she pointed again at him, a gesture amplified by certainty. Her 2 words echoed in the defendant's mind: bad man. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. He swallowed hard, tried to form a rebuttal, but the words felt hollow. Bad man. It wasn't just a judgment, it was an indictment, an exposure, a pronouncement of truth that no legal argument could override. His stomach knotted, his chest tightened, and for the first time in weeks, he felt powerless. Max shifted slightly, the subtle movement enough to signal that he, too, recognized the man's guilt. The dog's growl, low and almost imperceptible, vibrated in the room. The sound was enough to make several jurors lean forward instinctively, sensing danger in a way that transcended words. Max was trained to protect, to detect, to act. But in this moment, his body language alone carried authority, silently affirming the toddler's declaration. The prosecutor leaned forward, sensing the change in energy. His eyes flicked between the defendant and the toddler, understanding immediately that the courtroom's balance had shifted. "Your Honor," he said, calm but charged with tension, "the court has just witnessed a highly unusual but significant development. We may need to consider how this impacts witness statements and evidence interpretation." The defense attorney's face went pale. He had anticipated every angle of the trial, prepared for months with motions, witnesses, and cross-examinations. But no amount of preparation could account for a child's instinctive perception. The man's eyes darted around the room, seeking validation, seeking allies, but he found only anticipation, curiosity, and judgment in every gaze. In the gallery, whispers had become murmurs of disbelief. Some leaned toward each other, trying to rationalize what had happened. "It's impossible," one man whispered. "She's just a kid." A woman replied under her breath, "But somehow she knows." Phones rose to capture the moment, recording the toddler's innocence as it collided with the gravity of the courtroom. The defendant's mind spun. He tried to focus on the legal arguments, the evidence, the inconsistencies, but it was impossible. The toddler's words, so simple and pure, cut through the fog of his defenses. "Bad man." The phrase repeated in his head, echoing in rhythm with the nervous tapping of his foot and the faint growl of Max. He tried to rationalize it, coincidence, luck, imagination. But deep down, he knew it was accurate. His throat tightened as memories he had buried surfaced unbidden. Every corner he had turned in the neighborhood, every secret transaction, every victim he had intimidated, the toddler's finger seemed to illuminate it all. There was no hiding, no deception, no legal loophole that could shield him from the piercing clarity of those two words. The judge, observing the defendant's unraveling, kept a careful eye on the courtroom dynamics. "Counsel," he said firmly, "control your client. The court will not tolerate disruptions. Proceed with decorum." But even he could not hide the tension coiling in the air. Every observer sensed that something extraordinary was unfolding. A child had intervened in the adult world of law and consequences in a way that no one could have anticipated. Max shifted again, this time placing a paw slightly forward, almost as if asserting dominance, protection, and judgment simultaneously. The subtle movement caused the defendant's head to twitch, his eyes narrowing. There was something in the dog's gaze that he couldn't explain, a silent accusation that mirrored the toddler's declaration. He realized in a panic that the room was not just watching him. The courtroom itself seemed to weigh him, measuring guilt with eyes he could not escape. The toddler's mother tried to calm her child, whispering, "That's enough, sweetie. Sit down." But the toddler, sensing the weight of the moment, did not relent. Her eyes remained locked on the man, her tiny hand pointing with unwavering conviction. Innocence and instinct had merged in her expression, a clarity that seemed almost supernatural in its precision. The defense attorney attempted a feeble counter, gesturing toward the child. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant. A child cannot provide testimony, cannot interpret criminality." His words, meant to reassure, sounded hollow. The defendant's panic grew, feeding on the attorney's faltering confidence. The man realized he was alone in that moment, facing the judgment of a child and a dog simultaneously. The courtroom silence stretched unbearably. Every juror leaned forward, every reporter paused mid-pen stroke, every officer in the room felt the tension in their chest. It was a charged moment, pregnant with the possibility that the tiniest, simplest observations could outweigh months of legal strategy. Finally, the man shifted in his seat, his face pale, jaw tight, and eyes darting wildly. For the first time, he was forced to confront what he had always denied, that someone, or something, knew the truth. And in that courtroom, under the gaze of a toddler and the quiet authority of a police dog, he could not escape it. And then, just as he opened his mouth to speak, a sound cut through the room, Max's growl, low and deliberate, rising into a bark that filled the courtroom. The dog stepped slightly forward, gaze unwavering, the movement small but charged with meaning. The defendant recoiled, sliding back in his chair, realizing with chilling clarity that the courtroom now had witnesses beyond human comprehension, witnesses who saw through every lie, every shadow, every hidden act. The toddler giggled softly, pointing again, as if affirming Max's action. Her two words were no longer just a phrase, they were a verdict, whispered with the innocence only a child could carry, yet piercing enough to freeze a grown man's heart. The judge raised an eyebrow, the gallery held its collective breath, and the defendant, once arrogant, untouchable, and fearless, sat paralyzed, staring at a toddler and a dog that had become the most formidable forces in his life. In that moment, the realization struck him like lightning. He had lost control, not to the law, not to the prosecutors, not even to evidence, but to innocence itself. And that loss was terrifying. The courtroom had become a pressure cooker. Every whisper, every shuffle of paper, every creak of a chair amplified the tension that radiated from the front bench. The toddler had spoken, the words were uttered, and now the ripple effect spread faster than anyone could control. Bad man. From the gallery, eyes darted everywhere, scanning reactions, measuring responses, trying to piece together the inexplicable. Some leaned forward, gripping the wooden benches with taut fingers, the veins in their hands standing out like cords. Others covered their mouths in disbelief. Old men who had witnessed decades of trials whispered to their neighbors in shaky tones. Did she really say that? One murmured. A child knows what no adult could. Reporters, strategically positioned, scribbled furiously in their notebooks, pausing occasionally to glance at their phones, realizing they were capturing something that could not be quantified: raw, unfiltered truth. Cameras clicked, capturing the toddler's innocent yet piercing gaze, the police dog's unwavering stare, and the defendant's pale, crumbling composure. Each frame told a story more powerful than months of legal strategy, more damning than any affidavit or testimony. Whispers coiled and slithered like smoke through the courtroom. "It's impossible," a middle-aged man muttered to the woman beside him, voice quivering. "How could she possibly know?" The woman shook her head, eyes wide. "She sees something adults can't," she said, her words trembling with awe. Across the room, people instinctively leaned in, catching fragments of conversations, the words bouncing off polished wood and echoing in the cavernous chamber. The jurors were trapped in a storm of conflicting thoughts. Legally, they were instructed to weigh evidence, hear witnesses, and consider facts. But instinctually, they could not ignore what had just happened. A child, no more than 2 years old, had identified the defendant in a way that no adult had dared to. She had spoken a truth stripped of complexity, doubt, and deception. And somehow, that truth carried a weight impossible to ignore. The defendant sat frozen, his knuckles white, his lips pressed into a tight line. He tried to look away, tried to focus on his attorney, tried to imagine himself somewhere else, anywhere else, but it was impossible. Every gaze in the room, every subtle twitch of a hand, every breath carried judgment. He was trapped under the spotlight of perception, a perception he could not manipulate, a perception he could not deny. Max shifted slightly, the movement small but charged with authority. The dog's eyes remained fixed on the defendant, following his every subtle motion. His growl had quieted to a low rumble, but the vibration was enough to make the defendant flinch. The jurors noticed the subtle interaction, exchanging uneasy glances. This was no ordinary courtroom scene. The dog's behavior, combined with the toddler's clarity, created an atmosphere that defied explanation and logic. Meanwhile, the toddler sat back slightly, still pointing, her eyes shining. She didn't understand the gravity of her words, nor did she care about legal procedures. But she had made an observation, a pure instinctive insight that had rippled through the courtroom, twisting the very fabric of the trial. Her mother's hands trembled as she held her daughter, torn between pride and fear. "Sweetie, sit down," she whispered, though her voice lacked authority. Even she was caught in the surreal weight of the moment. The whispers in the gallery intensified, weaving a tapestry of speculation and disbelief. Some voices leaned toward excitement, others toward fear. "It's like she knows him," one woman whispered, a shiver running down her spine. "But she's just a child." Someone else protested quietly, though the words carried no conviction. People craned their necks to catch every gesture, every glance, every small shift that might reveal what the toddler was sensing. A young man in the back of the gallery raised his phone, quietly filming the scene. His voice, barely audible, whispered to the person beside him, "This is unreal. This little girl is calling out a criminal while everyone else missed it." His friend shivered. "She's not just seeing him, she's exposing him." The tension extended beyond mere observation. It became palpable. The air itself seemed thick, charged with electricity, as if the room collectively knew that justice was being shaped in real time by forces no one could fully understand. The adult witnesses, many of whom had spent years observing human behavior, felt a creeping unease. Some glanced at one another, unsure whether to speak, to react, to validate the toddler's perception. Every adult realized they were participating in a moment that defied logic, a moment that would be recounted in astonishment for years to come. The defendant's attorney tried to regain control, leaning toward his client and whispering hurried instructions. "Ignore her, it's irrelevant. We'll handle this," he said, voice quivering. But even he could not hide the tremor of fear. Every instinct told him that the courtroom had shifted in a way he could not recover from. The toddler's words had pierced the veil of legal maneuvering, and the defendant's unraveling was now an observable spectacle. In the gallery, older spectators whispered memories of past trials. "I've seen criminals fall before," one muttered, "but never because of a child." The words hung in the air, heavy and resonant. Young spectators, who often absorbed news in seconds, leaned forward, realizing they were witnessing something extraordinary. Cameras clicked, phones vibrated with notifications, and every recording device captured a moment that no one could replicate or fabricate. Even the court officers felt the shift. Normally rigid and composed, they moved with heightened awareness, scanning the room, sensing a subtle danger that was more psychological than physical. Max, the police dog, remained their anchor. His presence, quiet yet commanding, reinforced the toddler's instinctive declaration. The defendant's fear was no longer abstract. It was tangible, radiating outward, infecting everyone in the room. The toddler, sensing the growing tension, tilted her head slightly. Her small voice, almost drowned by the whispers, rang out again, barely audible but piercing. "See." Her mother, heart hammering, clutched her daughter tightly. She could feel the energy of the room, could feel that the courtroom itself had been transformed by a child's instinctive perception. At that moment, the judge's eyes swept across the gallery. He adjusted his glasses, scanning jurors, witnesses, and spectators alike. "Order," he said firmly, though even he could feel the electric tension in the room. "Let it be noted. The court recognizes the unusual and noteworthy impact of recent events. We will proceed with caution, and all parties are reminded to maintain decorum." The gallery quieted, though the whispers persisted, now laced with awe, fear, and curiosity. Some leaned closer to one another, whispering fragments of speculation. Could she be right? How is it possible a child could see this? The dog, he's in on it too. Each observation added layers of suspense, creating a sense that the courtroom was no longer merely a place of law, but a stage on which something extraordinary was unfolding. The defendant slumped slightly, jaw tight, palms sweating. He had faced scrutiny, interrogation, and investigation before, but never in a scenario like this. A toddler and a dog had combined forces, instinctively, to reveal what months of legal work had not. The realization settled like ice in his veins. No amount of legal maneuvering could undo the moment. No argument could erase the truth exposed by innocence and instinct. And in the midst of all this, the toddler giggled softly, leaning against her mother, pointing once more at Max, then at the defendant, eyes shining. The room collectively held its breath, sensing that the next moment could change everything. Because one simple truth had been made clear. In this courtroom, in this trial, whispers in the gallery were no longer just murmurs. They were the echo of a revelation that could not be ignored. The air in the courtroom was taut with anticipation, each breath measured, each glance weighted. What had started as an ordinary day of trial had transformed into a theater of tension and disbelief. The defendant sat rigid, jaw clenched, eyes darting nervously from the toddler to Max and back to the prosecutor. The murmurs from the gallery had quieted, replaced by a thick, expectant silence. Everyone seemed to know something was about to happen. The prosecutor rose, carefully, his voice calm but imbued with intensity. "Your Honor," he said, "the court has received new evidence that directly correlates with observations made today." He turned to face the jury, letting the moment stretch. "We believe this evidence will clarify certain details that have previously remained ambiguous." A low murmur ran through the room. The gallery leaned in. Even the defendant's defense attorney stiffened in his chair. Months of preparation had been undone by a two-word declaration from a toddler, and now the prosecutors were presenting tangible proof. The shift was palpable. The prosecutor gestured toward a large screen that descended from above, lighting up the front of the courtroom with a flicker of anticipation. "Security footage," he began, voice steady, previously overlooked, has been re-examined in light of recent events. The screen flickered to life, showing a grainy image of the streets near the crime scene. At first, it looked like any other ordinary footage: pedestrians, parked cars, shadows stretching long in the afternoon sun. But then the camera angle shifted, and there he was. The defendant froze. His eyes widened as he recognized the figure in the footage, himself, lurking near the scene carrying a dark shape in his hands. It was fleeting, almost imperceptible, a detail that had gone unnoticed until now. But the toddler's words had highlighted it. The pointer finger, the simple declaration of "bad man," had guided the investigators to focus where everyone else had missed. The gallery gasped. Some people leaned forward, gripping the edges of the benches. Reporters scribbled frantically, capturing the footage frame by frame. A whisper rose from the back. "It matches, it's him." The murmurs spread, infecting the room with a mix of awe and disbelief. The toddler remained in her mother's lap, watching the screen with wide eyes. She didn't fully understand what she was seeing, but instinctively she pointed again at the screen, a small finger confirming what no adult had dared to articulate. "See," she whispered, her voice soft but filled with certainty. Max shifted slightly, moving a paw toward the edge of the screen, as if reinforcing the toddler's gesture. His eyes, intelligent and unwavering, seemed to say what no one could put into words. The truth was undeniable. The defendant swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had been meticulous, careful, confident. But now, in the face of a toddler's insight and a dog's intuition, he was cornered. The defense attorney rose, attempting to object. "Your Honor, this footage, this is circumstantial. It does not prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt." The judge held up a hand, silencing him. "Let the evidence be presented in full," he said, eyes narrowing. "The court will consider the relevance and weight. Proceed." The prosecutor continued, pointing to the screen, highlighting moments that had previously gone unnoticed. There was a shadow moving just out of the main frame. There was a fleeting hand gesture. There was the defendant's distinct stride. Each frame, when examined carefully, painted a picture that aligned perfectly with the toddler's words. Every juror leaned forward, eyes wide. Even the gallery could feel the weight of proof settling over the room like a heavy curtain. The defendant's breathing quickened. He tried to shift, to appear composed, but every muscle in his body betrayed him. His eyes flicked nervously from the screen to the toddler to Max, as if each glance added another layer to his growing panic. The man who had once believed himself untouchable was now reduced to a spectator in his own downfall. The prosecutor turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this footage, previously overlooked, has now been verified. It confirms the defendant's presence at the scene, at the exact time of the incident in question. The child's declaration, simple, unassuming, and pure, has pointed us to a critical piece of evidence that might otherwise have remained hidden." The gallery erupted into whispered reactions. Some shook their heads, incredulous at the simplicity of the truth. "A child noticed what adults couldn't see," someone whispered, "and the dog he knew too." The defendant's face drained of color. His hands fumbled with the papers on the table, fingers twitching uncontrollably. He tried to speak, to argue, to assert control, but the words caught in his throat. The weight of the footage, combined with the toddler's uncanny insight, left him speechless. Max let out a soft, low growl, almost conversational in its timing. It wasn't aggression, it was acknowledgement. He had detected the truth, and he had confirmed it silently, with presence and poise. The jurors noticed the interaction, exchanging glances filled with both apprehension and fascination. The toddler pointed again, small finger unwavering. "There," she whispered, her tone innocent but unmistakable. It was as if she were saying, "This is what I meant. This is why he is a bad man." The prosecutor nodded, a faint smile of vindication crossing his face. He had suspected the defendant's guilt, had pieced together clues, and had built a case. But it was the unfiltered, instinctive clarity of a child that had illuminated the path to undeniable evidence. The gallery seemed to hold its collective breath. The reality of what had just occurred was impossible to ignore. A toddler had indirectly uncovered a critical piece of evidence, and a police dog had reinforced the perception, guiding attention in subtle but unmistakable ways. Every person in the room understood the gravity of the moment. The defense attorney's hands trembled as he tried to salvage his client's dignity. "Objection! This is circumstantial. It does not." The judge slammed his gavel, cutting through the room like a bolt of lightning. "The objection is noted, but the evidence will be considered in context. The court recognizes the unusual circumstances surrounding its discovery." The defendant slumped slightly, chest rising and falling rapidly. He realized in the pit of his stomach that this day would define him. That two words, so small, so innocent, had shifted the course of the trial, exposing him in a way he could never have anticipated. The gallery erupted into a mixture of gasps, whispers, and stunned silence. Cameras clicked, pens scribbled, and phones recorded moments that would soon go viral. People were witnessing something extraordinary: justice, seemingly guided by innocence and instinct, unfolding in real time. The toddler leaned back, hugging her mother's arm, satisfied in her own way. She had noticed, pointed, and declared. And in her own quiet, unassuming way, she had shifted the balance of power in the room. Max settled back slightly, resting his massive head on his paws, eyes never leaving the defendant. The dog had done what dogs do best: observe, detect, protect. And in doing so, he had silently reinforced the toddler's declaration. The courtroom felt suspended in time. Evidence had shifted. Perceptions had shifted. And for the first time, the defendant understood that nothing, no amount of preparation, no legal maneuvering, no deception, could undo the truth that had been laid bare in front of everyone, that he had been exposed in every sense by forces far beyond the ordinary. And as the screen flickered off, leaving the room dim and tense, the prosecutor leaned forward slightly, voice calm but cutting through the charged silence. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you have seen the evidence. Judge it carefully and remember the clarity that revealed it." The whispers in the gallery resumed, now a mixture of awe, fear, and incredulity. People leaned toward one another, murmuring in low tones. "She saw it first, and the dog he knew too." The defendant sat motionless, realizing with a cold certainty that the trial had reached a turning point. The evidence had shifted, the balance had shifted, and there was no turning back. The toddler pointed one last time, small finger unwavering, eyes shining with innocence and certainty. And in that simple gesture the courtroom collectively understood. The truth had spoken. The courtroom, already electric with tension, seemed to pulse with an almost tangible energy. Every juror leaned forward slightly, as if the simple act of sitting still had become impossible. The gallery remained hushed, spectators holding their collective breath. The toddler had spoken. The evidence had shifted. And now a key witness, one who had previously been considered neutral, or at least unreliable, was about to take the stand. The man shuffled forward, white-knuckled and visibly nervous. He had been one of the last people to see the defendant on the day in question, but until now, his testimony had been vague, almost dismissive. He had claimed to notice nothing, to see nothing unusual. But after the toddler's 2 words and the revelation of the security footage, the prosecution had called him back for clarification. The gallery murmured. Whispers like wind through leaves rustled through the room. Some speculated, would he confirm the defendant's guilt or crumble under the mounting pressure? Some exchanged nervous glances, sensing that this moment might become another domino tipping the trial irreversibly. He sat down in the witness chair, eyes darting nervously from the toddler to Max to the defendant. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the edge of the stand. The judge cleared his throat, bringing a semblance of order to the room. "Please state your name for the record," he commanded. The witness swallowed hard. Mark Daniels," he said, voice quivering. The words were simple, yet the tension behind them made them feel monumental. The prosecutor stepped forward, calm and measured, but radiating authority. "Mr. Daniels, you were near the scene on the day in question, correct?" Mark nodded, swallowing again. "Yes, I was walking my dog nearby." "Did you notice the defendant?" the prosecutor asked, eyes locked on him. Mark's lips parted and then closed, a visible struggle passing across his face. I thought I didn't," he whispered, almost to himself. "I thought I didn't see him." A faint gasp rippled through the gallery. The jurors exchanged tense looks. The tension was suffocating. Even the toddler leaned forward slightly, small fingers curling around her mother's arm as if sensing the importance of the moment. The prosecutor's gaze didn't waver. "Please, Mr. Daniels, tell the court what you noticed once you reviewed the security footage and considered the events earlier today." Mark's hands shook more violently now. His eyes flickered toward the toddler, then Max, and finally rested on the defendant, who was pale and rigid, knuckles pressing into the edge of the table. I saw him," Mark said, voice cracking. "I didn't notice him before, but after the dog barked, and then after the child pointed, I saw him. I saw him with my own eyes." The courtroom collectively held its breath. The murmurs from the gallery turned into whispers of astonishment. Every juror's eyes widened. The defendant's face paled further, a ghost of panic replacing the last vestiges of composure he had clung to. He opened his mouth to argue, to deny, but no sound came. The words of a toddler and the instinct of a dog had cornered him in a way months of careful legal maneuvering had never done. Max let out a low, affirming growl, the subtle vibration of his chest filling the room with an almost palpable sense of validation. He shifted slightly forward, positioning himself between the defendant and the witness, silent and commanding, a living reminder that truth had allies even beyond human comprehension. The prosecutor leaned forward, voice calm but cutting through the silence. "Mr. Daniels, please describe exactly what you observed." Mark swallowed hard, taking a deep breath as if trying to steady himself. I saw him approach the alley. He had something in his hand, something dark. I didn't notice it before. I thought I hadn't seen anything unusual. But then the dog barked and I noticed, and the child pointed and I saw him. I saw everything." A collective gasp erupted from the gallery. Some spectators covered their mouths, eyes wide in disbelief. Others whispered excitedly, passing the story along in real time. The courtroom was alive with a mixture of awe, fear, and incredulity. A 2-year-old child had not only pointed out the defendant, but had catalyzed a revelation that unraveled the testimony of an adult witness. The defendant's hands twitched. He was trembling now, unable to hide the growing panic in his body. The air in the courtroom seemed to shrink around him, compressing like a vice. Every heartbeat felt amplified. Every glance from the toddler, every watchful eye of Max, pressed him further into his own guilt. The defense attorney rose, trying to salvage composure. "Objection. The witness's memory is influenced by external factors, by the child, by the dog. This is unfair and prejudicial." The judge's gavel struck sharply. "Overruled," he said firmly. "The witness's observations are being presented in context. The jury will weigh the credibility of testimony as instructed." Mark's eyes darted nervously, but he found courage in the courtroom's energy. I can't explain it," he admitted, voice shaking. "But I know what I saw, and it matches exactly what the child and the dog noticed. I didn't see it before, but now I can't deny it. He's guilty." The words reverberated through the room. Murmurs escalated into soft gasps of astonishment. Some jurors exchanged stunned glances, as if confirming silently that they were witnessing something extraordinary. The gallery buzzed with tension, every observer acutely aware that the trial had entered uncharted territory. The toddler clutched her mother's hand tightly, small fingers curling in a gesture of silent confidence. She had seen it first, she had spoken first, and now she had unknowingly guided the adult witness to the truth. Max, massive and unwavering, adjusted slightly, chest rising and falling in measured breaths, as if nodding in affirmation of the child's declaration. The defendant's face was ashen. His lips trembled, but no words came. The carefully constructed facade of confidence and control had dissolved entirely. Panic radiated off him in visible waves, his mind spiraling. Every angle of defense, every loophole he had relied upon, had been neutralized by a combination of innocence, instinct, and unyielding truth. The prosecutor leaned forward, voice calm but sharp. "Ladies and gentlemen, the witness has now confirmed what the evidence, the child's declaration, and the dog's behavior have indicated. It is not conjecture, it is fact. The defendant's presence at the scene is corroborated, and the observations are consistent across multiple perspectives." The courtroom remained suspended in a state of tense awe. Reporters continued scribbling, capturing each detail. Phones quietly recorded snippets of the testimony, destined to circulate far beyond the walls of the courthouse. Spectators leaned in, collectively sensing that history was unfolding in real time. The judge finally spoke, voice resonant and deliberate. "The court acknowledges the unusual nature of this testimony and the corroboration presented. All parties are reminded to maintain decorum and continue proceedings accordingly." The defendant slumped slightly in his chair, chest heaving, eyes fixed on the toddler and Max. He could not escape the realization that he had been seen, unmasked, and cornered by forces he had never imagined, forces beyond legal strategy or manipulation. A child's instinct and a dog's training had exposed him in a way that no adult witness alone could have achieved. Mark Daniels returned to his seat, still visibly shaken. The gallery murmured, whispers turning into a low, collective hum of disbelief and awe. Every adult in the room, from jurors to lawyers to spectators, felt the shift. The balance of the trial had tilted irrevocably, guided by the unfiltered clarity of innocence and instinct. And somewhere in that thick, tension-filled air, one question lingered like a shadow. What else would be revealed next, and who, or what, would speak the next truth that could change everything? The courtroom had reached a fever pitch. Every juror leaned forward in their chairs, their collective focus locked on the defendant, who now sat rigid, jaw clenched, eyes darting like trapped prey. The gallery, though hushed, radiated a sense of suspense so thick it seemed to vibrate in the polished wooden air. The toddler sat in her mother's lap, fingers still gripping the arm of her chair, eyes wide and unblinking, absorbing every motion, every expression. Max, the massive German shepherd, remained poised near the front, a living sentinel. His ears pricked, eyes trained on the defendant, chest rising and falling in measured, almost intimidating rhythm. He exuded calm authority, but there was no mistaking the tension in his body. Every muscle was ready, every sense alert. It was as if he were silently declaring to the courtroom that he, too, could recognize the truth, and he would not let it be hidden. The defendant's attorney fumbled through papers, his face pale, voice quivering as he tried to reassert control. "Your Honor, perhaps a brief recess." The judge's gavel struck sharply, cutting through the air like a blade. "No," he said, voice firm and deliberate. "We proceed. The court will continue. All parties are to maintain decorum." His eyes swept over the room, lingering on the defendant with a sharp, penetrating gaze. "The time for evasion is over. We are here for the truth." The defendant shifted in his chair, knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of the table. Sweat beaded along his temples. Every instinct screamed that he was cornered, that the walls were closing in. Months of planning, manipulation, and intimidation had unraveled in a single day, a day shaped by the unassuming observations of a toddler and the silent vigilance of a police dog. The prosecutor stood, eyes blazing with controlled intensity. "Your Honor, the court has now heard corroborating testimony, reviewed critical evidence, and observed the clear, instinctive recognition of the defendant's guilt by a witness, a child, and a trained law enforcement animal." His gaze swept across the jury. "It is now time to confront the defendant directly, in a manner that leaves no ambiguity as to the veracity of the evidence and the weight of the observations presented." The gallery leaned forward, the murmurs dying down into a tense hush. Every reporter poised, pens ready, cameras angled to capture the inevitable confrontation. The air was heavy, charged with anticipation, as if the next words spoken might alter reality itself. The defendant's eyes flicked to the toddler, who now sat forward slightly, fingers wrapped tightly around her mother's arm. She didn't understand the gravity of the moment, yet instinctively she seemed to sense the power of her own declaration. The words "bad man" had not been forgotten. They lingered like a judgment suspended over him. The judge's voice broke the tension. "Defendant, you may respond to the allegations presented today, including the witness testimony and the evidence correlated by the child and the police dog." His tone was calm, yet unyielding, as if daring the man to speak and fail. The defendant opened his mouth, words forming, faltering, vanishing into the thick silence. He tried again. I don't." The gallery gasped softly. The words, weak and unsure, carried none of the confidence he had relied upon. His defense attorney attempted to interject, but the judge's gavel silenced him immediately. "The court will hear the defendant directly," the judge said. "No interruptions." The man's gaze flicked again to Max. The dog's eyes locked onto him, unwavering and unblinking. There was no threat in that gaze, yet the defendant felt every ounce of accusation it carried. His lips trembled. He tried to smile, a weak attempt at deflection, but it faltered almost immediately. The toddler, sensing the charged energy, pointed again, not at the defendant this time, but at the screen that displayed the security footage from earlier. "See," she whispered softly, her voice carrying clarity that made even the adults in the room pause. "He did it." The courtroom fell into a collective hush. It was a simple statement, yet its weight was monumental. The defendant's jaw tightened. His breathing grew shallow. He realized with chilling clarity that the toddler, in her innocent observation, had encapsulated the truth he had tried so desperately to hide. The prosecutor stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough that only the defendant could hear. "You've been seen," he said quietly, deliberately, "by witnesses, by evidence, by a child, and by a dog trained to detect truth and danger. There is nowhere to hide now." The defendant's hands shook violently as he tried to steady himself. He looked toward his attorney, who avoided eye contact, knowing there was no defense that could counteract the weight of the observations before the court. Months of careful planning, falsified alibis, and manipulated evidence had collapsed under the simplest, purest scrutiny, the instinct of a child and the perception of a trained animal. Mark Daniels, the adult witness, leaned forward in his seat, still visibly shaken. "I didn't see him before," he admitted, voice trembling. "But now I know, I saw everything, and it's exactly as the child said." His eyes, wide with a mix of fear and resolve, met the defendant's directly. "You're guilty." Max let out a low growl, more deliberate this time, echoing through the room. It was a sound that seemed to vibrate in the bones of every observer, commanding attention, demanding recognition of truth. The jurors exchanged tense glances, sensing that the dog's presence was as impactful as any testimony or evidence presented. The defendant's face drained of color. His chest heaved with shallow breaths, and for the first time he looked small, exposed, and cornered. He realized the courtroom had become a theater not of law alone, but of instinct, observation, and revelation. The toddler, the witness, and the dog together had created an environment where deception could not survive. He tried to speak again, but his voice was barely audible. I did." The toddler tilted her head, eyes narrowing slightly, fingers pointing insistently. "Yes, you did," she whispered. Her words were innocent, yet they carried a piercing weight, cutting through every feeble excuse he attempted to muster. The gallery reacted almost instinctively. Gasps, whispered affirmations, and the shuffle of feet filled the room. Even the judge leaned slightly forward, his gaze unyielding, as if acknowledging the extraordinary unfolding of events. Every adult in the courtroom was aware that they were witnessing something extraordinary, justice, delivered not solely through law, but through the unfiltered perception of a child and the silent authority of a dog. The prosecutor's voice rose slightly, firm but measured. Defendant, the court has observed your reactions, reviewed corroborated evidence, and heard testimony that confirms your actions. You are now confronted with the truth, and it is undeniable. The observations of this child and this dog are clear. You cannot hide from them. The defendant's hands trembled uncontrollably. His eyes darted frantically from the toddler to Max to the jury, searching for a lifeline, for an escape, for any semblance of control. There was none. He had been stripped bare by a force he had never anticipated, innocence coupled with instinct. And then the toddler leaned back slightly, small voice carrying clearly to the front of the courtroom. You have to tell the truth. It was a simple sentence, spoken with the directness only a child could muster, yet it landed like a hammer. Every person in the courtroom felt its impact. The defendant's knees trembled. He realized with bone-deep clarity that the walls of deception had collapsed. The very instruments of justice, the law, witnesses, evidence, were now supported by the raw power of perception that could not be manipulated. Max shifted forward slightly, gaze fixed on the defendant. A low, resonant growl filled the room, punctuating the child's words. The combination of innocent command and animal authority was impossible to ignore. The courtroom seemed to lean in collectively, holding its breath. Every observer, every juror, every reporter understood that a confrontation had reached its apex. The defendant could no longer rely on manipulation, strategy, or fear. He faced the combined clarity of innocence, instinct, and truth, and it was absolute. For the first time, the man who had once believed himself untouchable, above scrutiny, and beyond the reach of morality understood. The confrontation was not just legal. It was personal, emotional, inescapable, and final. The judge's gavel hovered, heavy in his hand, as the room waited. The moment was suspended, the tension crackling like static electricity. The defendant's next words, or lack thereof, would define not only his fate but the extraordinary legacy of the toddler and the police dog who had brought him to this precipice. And in that charged silence, the courtroom understood the truth. Justice had arrived in the most unexpected of forms. The courtroom had become a chamber of electricity. Every heartbeat, every breath seemed amplified. The confrontation had left the defendant hollow, stripped of bravado, exposed in front of everyone he had ever sought to intimidate. The toddler sat quietly in her mother's lap, fingers still entwined around the arm, eyes wide but unwavering, her innocence now wielding an almost tangible authority. Max, the German shepherd, remained poised, a sentinel of judgment, chest rising and falling with measured calm as if silently overseeing the final act of this extraordinary trial. The jurors, who had been instructed to weigh evidence carefully, were now visibly shaken. They had witnessed a child speak truth with the clarity of a prophet, a witness recant previous uncertainty, and a trained dog reinforce observations with instinctive authority. Their eyes darted nervously from the defendant to the toddler, to the screen that had displayed the damning footage, and finally to one another, silently acknowledging the gravity of what had occurred. The judge leaned forward slightly, gavel in hand. His eyes swept over the courtroom, lingering on the defendant whose face had lost all color. The man's hands trembled on the table, fingernails pressing deep into the polished wood. He had once believed himself untouchable. Now he was merely human, fallible, exposed, and cornered. Members of the jury, the judge began, voice steady but heavy with the weight of the moment, you have seen the evidence. You have heard testimony corroborated by multiple witnesses, and you have observed interactions that are unprecedented in this courtroom. The time has come to deliberate and reach a verdict. A hush fell over the gallery. Even the toddler's mother held her breath, instinctively squeezing her daughter's hand. She could feel the tension coiling in the room, thick and suffocating, as if everyone collectively sensed that the next few moments would carry consequences far beyond the trial itself. The jury filed into the deliberation room, leaving the courtroom nearly silent. The only sounds were the low hum of fluorescent lights and the faint shifting of papers. In that silence, the defendant slumped forward, pressing his face into his hands, fighting the panic clawing at his chest. He could hear in his mind the words that had started it all. Bad man. Two simple words, yet they had catalyzed a chain of events that no legal maneuver could undo. Outside the courtroom, the murmurs in the hallways were electric. Reporters whispered excitedly into recorders, their eyes alight with disbelief. The story was already forming in their minds. A toddler, a police dog, and a man brought to justice by a combination of instinct, innocence, and perseverance. Phones vibrated with breaking news notifications. Social media buzzed with anticipation, though no one yet had the full picture. Inside the courtroom, time stretched. The defendant sat frozen, unable to comprehend the slow, grinding reality of what was coming. The months of preparation, manipulation, and intimidation had crumbled in a single day, dismantled by forces he could neither control nor understand. He realized that his fate was no longer in the hands of law alone. It was entwined with instinct, perception, and truth itself. Finally, the jury returned. The room felt smaller, denser, each breath heavier than the last. Every eye in the courtroom tracked their every step as they took their seats, faces solemn and grave. The foreperson stood, papers in hand, eyes scanning the room before looking directly at the judge. "Your Honor," the foreperson began, voice steady but loaded with the weight of responsibility, "we, the jury, have reached a verdict." The defendant's eyes snapped up, hope flaring briefly before sinking into dread. His mouth opened to protest, but no words came. Max shifted slightly, low growl vibrating through the floorboards as if underscoring the moment. The toddler pointed faintly toward the jury, her small finger trembling with anticipation, eyes wide and lips slightly parted. The foreperson cleared their throat. "On the charges brought against the defendant, we find him guilty." The words reverberated through the courtroom like a hammer striking steel. Gasps erupted, whispers swelled, and a collective tension broke into stunned silence. The defendant's face drained of every remaining color. His jaw slackened, eyes wide with disbelief. He had known consequences, yes, but he had never imagined a verdict delivered with such inevitability, such unassailable clarity. The toddler clapped her small hands softly, her expression a mix of joy and innocence. She didn't understand the full weight of the legal terminology, but she had seen the truth and declared it, and now it had been acknowledged. Max let out a deep, satisfied exhale, lying back with dignity and calm authority. Justice, it seemed, had been served, not just by human hands but by instinct, perception, and the uncompromising clarity of innocence. The gallery erupted. Some whispered in awe, others murmured in relief. Cameras clicked frantically, recording faces, reactions, and the palpable atmosphere of vindication. The defendant remained frozen, hands trembling, jaw tight, staring at the toddler, at Max, and at the jury that had rendered the ultimate judgment. The judge rose, his gavel striking with measured authority. "The court acknowledges the verdict. Sentencing will proceed as prescribed by law. The proceedings are concluded for today." The defendant was led away in handcuffs, shoulders slumped, a man unmasked and humbled. His eyes lingered on the toddler, a mixture of fear, disbelief, and grudging acknowledgement. Somewhere deep in his mind, he understood that the simplicity of her words, her instinctive clarity, had been more powerful than any defense, any scheme, or any attempt to manipulate the system. The toddler's mother breathed a sigh of relief, hugging her daughter tightly. She could feel the room's energy settle, a release of tension that had built to almost unbearable levels. Around them, the courtroom buzzed with quiet conversation, reporters scribbling furiously, spectators exchanging amazed glances. Max, his duty fulfilled, remained calm but alert. He had witnessed human deception, perceived intent, and now observed justice delivered. To the adults, he was a dog, but in this courtroom he had been more. A silent arbiter, a guardian of truth, a living witness to clarity beyond words. Outside the courthouse, the story had already begun to spread. Phones and cameras captured the toddler's pointing gesture, her two simple words, the solemnity of Max and the defendant's collapse. News anchors spoke of the unprecedented scene, analysts debated the psychological and legal implications, and social media erupted with awe and incredulity. A child had influenced a legal case in a way that no one had imagined possible. Inside, the courtroom slowly emptied. Jurors filed out, faces still reflecting the weight of the extraordinary events they had witnessed. The toddler, now in her mother's arms, looked around curiously, absorbing the reactions of the crowd. She had spoken two words that no adult had dared, observed what others overlooked, and without fully understanding it, shaped the course of justice. The defendant's absence left a lingering silence. His presence, though physically removed, remained palpable in memory and consequence. Adults whispered about the surreal intersection of innocence, instinct, and law. They marveled at the improbability of a toddler and a dog combining to reveal truth with such clarity. And for the toddler, it was over. The trial, the tension, the gravity, it was all abstract, a puzzle her young mind could not fully comprehend. But she had pointed, spoken, and been seen. Her two words, so small and simple, had carried monumental weight, altering lives and establishing a precedent for clarity beyond reasoning, beyond experience. Max rose, stretching, a low growl vibrating softly in his chest as he surveyed the room one last time. His duty, though silent and unassuming to some, had been fulfilled. The defendant had been exposed, truth had been affirmed, and justice had been served, not just through law but through observation, instinct, and the unyielding honesty of innocence. Outside, the sunlight fell on the courthouse steps, warm and bright, a stark contrast to the tension that had gripped the courtroom just hours before. The world had resumed its rhythm, but inside, everyone who had witnessed the trial knew something extraordinary had occurred. A toddler had spoken two words, a dog had stood watch, and a man had been unmasked. The story would ripple far beyond the walls of the courtroom, a tale of instinct, innocence, and the undeniable power of truth. In the end, justice was simple, and sometimes it came in the smallest voices and the quietest witnesses.